Hey there, and welcome. Today, we are digging into a really fascinating and I think important argument. The idea that the crises we're seeing all around us, in our universities, our courts, our public square, aren't just a series of random, unrelated failures. They're actually a symptom of something much deeper, a fundamental collapse in what you might call their moral architecture. You probably remember this moment from late 2023. It made headlines everywhere. But according to the source material we're looking at today, this wasn't just some political gaffe. It was a reveal. It was a spotlight shining on a leader who, when faced with a head-on collision between core values like free speech and safety, had no coherent framework, no blueprint to figure out what to do.
And that really is the heart of this entire explainer. The argument is that our institutions aren't necessarily failing because they're run by bad people. They're failing because their underlying philosophical blueprints are, well, structurally unsound. They're just not designed to handle the intense pressures of the real world.
Okay, so to really get a grip on this, we first need to diagnose the problem. What does this architectural failure actually look like day to day? Well, you see the cracks everywhere once you start looking. Universities tying themselves in absolute knots over what speech is okay and what isn't, courts handing down totally conflicting rulings on cases that look almost identical, and, social media platforms that seem to change their moderation rules with the wind. This isn't random chaos. It's the predictable, almost inevitable result of systems running on broken code.
So the source gives us this really powerful analogy, moral architecture. I want you to think about it like the blueprints for a bridge. You just wouldn't build a bridge without understanding basic engineering principles, right? Things like stress, load, and tension. Well, in the very same way, you can't build a trustworthy institution on an ethical system that doesn't have the structural features it needs to handle conflict and pressure.
So if our modern moral architecture is failing, where did we even get the blueprint? To really understand the flaw, we've got to compare the two foundational blueprints that have really shaped all of Western civilization. On one side, you have Athens, which represents Greek thought. It starts with the individual, all alone. It's always searching for perfect, abstract, absolute truths, and it values absolute rights above all else. But on the other side, you've got Jerusalem, representing Jewish thought. It starts not with the individual, but with relationships. It's not seeking perfection, it's seeking durable structures so that the community can survive. And it values mutual obligations, what we owe to each other. You can see how these two starting points are going to build vastly different worlds.
All right, so let's put that Athens model under the microscope for a minute. So many of our modern institutions are built on this foundation. So we're going to stress test it, and we're going to see why the source argues it just consistently collapses when things get tough.
And here is a crucial difference. Engineering and science have what the source calls a forcing function, and that function is reality. If your bridge design is bad, the bridge falls down. End of story. But philosophy doesn't have that. You can have a theory that is beautifully elegant, totally consistent on paper, and yet completely, utterly useless in the real world. And when you put these big Western ideas to the test, the flaws become glaringly obvious. Take utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. Sounds great, but it can justify sacrificing one innocent person for the sake of the many. Then there's rights theory. Everyone has absolute rights. But what happens when my absolute right crashes into your absolute right? The theory has no tiebreaker, which just leads to these endless, zero-sum battles. And critical theory defines everything as a power struggle, but it offers no real path to resolving that struggle or repairing the damage. And this process creates what the source brilliantly calls the simplicity to complexity death spiral. It goes like this. You start with a simple, clean idea, but then you realize it leads to some pretty awful outcomes. So instead of going back and rethinking the foundation, you just add patches, and more exceptions, until the original, simple idea is buried under a maze of contradictions and becomes totally useless for guidance. That isn't progress, it's just damage control. Okay, so if the Athens model is fundamentally broken, what's the alternative? Well, the source suggests we should look back to that Jerusalem blueprint and try to reverse engineer its principles into a much more resilient, ethical system. And the huge, fundamental shift is this. Instead of starting with a single person who has a list of rights, you start with a person who is embedded in a whole network of relationships. And it's out of those relationships that our obligations flow. The core question isn't, what am I owed? But what are my responsibilities to the people connected to me?
So at the very top of this system, the number one priority is the preservation of life. You can think of it as the ultimate trump card. It's the primary override because, well, it's pretty simple. Life is the precondition for everything else. You can't have dignity or justice or truth without living, breathing people. It gives you a clear, non-negotiable starting point when other values start to clash.
All right, number 2 is the inherent, absolute dignity of every single person. This is like a safety net. It's a minimum standard, a floor below which we can never allow people to be treated, no matter what. This is what stops the system from, say, sacrificing an individual for the so-called greater good. It ensures that people are always treated as ends in themselves, never as tools. Next up, number 3, is the idea of mutual responsibility. The core concept here is that we are all ethically entangled. You're responsible not just for the harm you directly cause, but also for the harm that you could have reasonably stepped in and prevented. It's a principle that says you can't just be a bystander to injustice. Inaction is also a choice, and it carries its own moral weight. Now, this concept of justice is really interesting because it's not just about cold, hard law. It's about finding a resolution that is both fair and merciful. The goal here isn't simply to punish someone who did something wrong. It's to restore balance to the community, to actually repair the relationships that were broken by the action. It's where law and compassion meet.
And finally, number 5, we have truth. And let's be really clear, this is not about my truth or your truth. This value is about objective reality, the way things are, independent of how we feel about them. Without that shared grounding in what's real, any functional neural system becomes totally impossible. It's the very bedrock that trust and understanding have to be built on.
So we've got these 5 core values: life, dignity, responsibility, justice, and truth. But you know, a list of values by itself isn't enough. A list of ingredients doesn't make a cake, right? You need a recipe. You need a structure for them to operate in, a kind of moral operating system. And the source calls this the ethosskeleton. The ethosskeleton is basically the set of universal rules that makes any ethical system trustworthy and resilient. It's those engineering principles we talked about with the bridge, but applied to morality. It's the how that allows the what, those 5 values, to actually work when life gets messy and complicated.
And this is where it all clicks into place. Look at these components. Remember those endless zero-sum battles from rights theory? They get solved by having clear override logic. Remember all that endless patching of flawed ideas? That's fixed by corrigibility, a built-in process for admitting and repairing errors. That sense that everyone is on their own, that's countered by relational integrity. This isn't a blueprint for a perfect utopia. It's a practical design for a real, imperfect world. And all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought. You know, the great philosophies of the Enlightenment promised they would build a better world by starting from scratch, with the rational individual. But what if the answer wasn't to invent something brand new? What if it was to rediscover the engineering principles of a system that's already been stress-tested for thousands of years? Maybe, just maybe, the key to fixing our modern, broken institutions isn't about looking forward to the next new idea, but about looking back at an architecture that has already proven it knows how to endure.